If the question becomes then, is how do we utilize the lack of sensory input to create these movement patterns? We look at this idea of central pattern generators. And so what we're going to look at is a neural circuitry that's located within the spinal cord. And this takes us back to that idea earlier when we talked about the interneurons within the spinal cord. But these central pattern generators and what we call CPGs within the spinal cord are capable of creating oscillatory patterns. And what that means is they're very cyclical in motion. And that's really what walking and running is this idea that we can create a cyclatory match pattern, and it's really repetitive, and basically it's just a combination of these flexion extensions. But you have some sort of input trigger that comes in, and this is oftentimes in response to something coming from the external environment, proprioception, but also it could just be a matter of needing to increase the ability of your movement. But the spinal cord has this ability within itself to produce these rhythmic excitations, and that therefore it does not need to go to the higher order of processing, which then again also limits the time required to create those movement patterns, right? And so if I don't have to go to information processing, the time it takes me to produce that movement also decreases in the process. So a couple of things I really want to focus on are these, right? So it's the oscillatory patterns, but also the flexion extension of your agonist and antagonist muscles and turning on and off those processes is really where the CPGs come into play. So going back to the cat and the idea that they have this mesencephalic preparation of the midbrain, and that's where they cut the spinal cord at the midbrain, severing the lower levels of the CNS from the higher levels of the CNS, and therefore the afferent pathways were not able to go up to the cortex and remove from higher order. And so it's this idea that they're unable to voluntarily move their legs because they can't consciously think about it, right? So this is that idea of conscious versus unconscious in the response chain hypothesis, and going forward where your body is just going through the process. Now, if you go into this PowerPoint and click on this link down here, that'll take you to the cat treadmill and you can see what's going on. But what basically happened is this cat, as the treadmill sped up, the cat was able to walk faster and maintain it through this oscillatory behavior of speeding up and creating the flexors extensors without having the ability to go to the general or the higher orders of the brain. And therefore, it's all, the idea is that at the location of the spinal cord, we have the ability to control these movements as well. So there is a pre-wired pattern generation theory, and it's turned on by some sort of stimulation in some sources. Now there's the idea that we have this basic pattern, and you have the ability to create modifications, right? So the cat has a quadruped gait pattern. Now there is walking, trotting, and sprinting, and if you look at horses, they have the same thing. And the idea is this cat is able to manipulate this basic pattern based on the speed of the treadmill without consciously thinking about it. Therefore, there's something going on the spinal cord level that allows this to go up. And it doesn't require a conscious awareness of that ability to manipulate their gait speed and the timing in the repetition of the flexion extension. Now, to do this kind of idea of a reflex involvement in maintenance of this original pattern, we have reciprocal inhibition, right? So that is the idea that flexors of a joint are inhibited as the extensors are activated. And so this is kind of the idea with your GTOs and your muscle spindles, and what they do is they also, if you go through a position that is too much with the contracting muscles or in the motion of the tendon, creates too much tension, it's going to inhibit those flexors and automatically excite the extensors, which creates the motion going the other direction, right? And then you have the cross extensor reflex, and this is the extensions of one limb are activated when the flexors of the opposing limb are activated. So if I have an extensor flexor, that really has to do with moving the ipsilateral the contralateral limbs in ability to make this gait pattern move and move rapidly, or whether or not I need to stabilize and go that direction, right? So if I'm walking downhill, I need to be flexing one limb while my other limb is extending, therefore getting prepared for the next fall. And then you have the tonic neck reflex, and this is turning the head to the right, facilitates the arm flexors on the left. And the extensions on the right. So it's that idea that whichever way my head turns, it's going to facilitate my two arms completely different. One will have a flexor and one will have an extensor. And you'll see that used a lot in some sort of rehab tools, the tonic reflex of the neck. And so as I do a lot with, or I prefer some, I can't think of the name of it right now, active release therapy for my chiropractic, and they use a lot of this kind of concept. If they're trying to dig on one side, they know that if I turn my head one way, it'll activate something, and they can really kind of dig into it on that other side. So this tonic neck reflex is really utilized a lot in therapy. But reflexes ensure that the CPGs, central pattern generators, carry themselves out effectively, even when you're having some sort of changes in an environment. And you see this, and I'll keep going back to this because this location in northern Idaho is really big for this in trail running in Colorado and things like that. Is if I'm trail running and I'm going through these normal patterns of motion and the terrain underneath me changes, I need to utilize these reflexes to really manipulate my gait pattern subconsciously. Otherwise, I'm going to fall because of the time it requires. And I think back when I'm a vibrant runner, so I wear five fingers sometimes. And my first half marathon, I was running in the Red Rock Hills of Las Vegas, Nevada. It's on the west side. There's some trails out there, and going and running, I stepped on a rock and I kind of buckled a little bit, but the ability of my reflexes to manipulate my extensions and flexors stopped me from buckling. So I did have a little bit of a perturbation in my gait pattern, but I was able to maintain an upright posture because I was able to respond quickly based on these reflexes. If I had to consciously think about it, I would have hit the ground. And this is one of the things they look at when you talk about elderly and fall prevention, is sometimes the reflexes are no longer working properly. Or they're inhibited, so it takes longer for them to respond in these patterns, and therefore they fall in a lot more frequently than somebody who their reflexes are totally intact and they're young and vibrant, right? And so the youth, as you're growing up and gaining more experience and learning how to manipulate or interact with your environment, you're learning how to incorporate these reflexes. So on both ends of the spectrum, one is you don't have the experiences and you haven't created enough CPGs to incorporate these reflexes well enough, and so you fall a bit, and then at the elderly you do it. So these muscle spindles are really the systems responsible for maintenance of muscle stiffness and in the GTOs as well, right? And so the idea is that these proprioceptions are providing that input that creates the reflexibility. So now, as we're talking really about this reflex and the CVGs and their ability, it's also important to understand that there are variations within triggered reactions. And this is this reflex reversal phenomenon. And what it means is that sometimes there are instances when, especially during locomotion, when a reflex does the opposite of what we think it should be doing. And really, it's this idea that if I'm walking and I put an electrical shock on my foot, it's going to behave differently whether that's my stance foot or whether it's a swing foot. So sometimes the flexors are going to be actually, if I'm in swing phase, the flexors are going to be stimulated quickly. But if I'm on stance phase and I get this electrical shock, maybe the extensors of that stance leg are activated. So this idea of they are a function of whatever task is being performed, and it's due to the specific phase of the activity, right? So these are two components that kind of play off each other. And it depends on, because if I think about this, if I was in my stance limb and the electrical shock stimulated my foot and my flexors were activated, what would happen? Again, I would fall. But if I'm in a swing phase in that electrical stimulus, maybe what I'm thinking is that I need to get more flexion in my knee because I need to get away from that stimulus. So this is a kind of a asterisk on this triggered reaction response. And this idea of reflexes and what they're meant for. And sometimes it just depends on the theory is more of reflex control. It explains these effects, and that evidence is showing that sometimes it may be a reversal of what we expect. So going forward, one of the other things we want to talk about is this degree of freedom problem with Nikolai Bernstein. He was the first one back in the 60s to really bring this to light. But sometimes the system has too many independent states, and we call these degrees of freedom, right? So each of your joints has a number of degrees of freedom, and as you kind of combine these together, like my lower leg, I have a hip, a knee, an ankle, and then each of the toes, and blah, 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 blah. But there's this kind of idea that degrees of freedom kind of compound each other, and to be controlled, that in our movement patterns, we have to be able to control these degrees of freedom to produce the desired outcome. And this is a lot where coordination stuff comes into play, but we wanted to mention it here. And what if actions are controlled, what controls the many degrees of freedom? And so you have these motor programs that are based off the structures. They are controlled by how you execute the task. And in this process, we have to organize degrees of freedom. And as we watch people, when we say one is more controlled or more coordinated than the other one, we're talking about their ability to manipulate their degrees of freedom and to produce this. But the idea is, can it be that simple? And so some of the ideas that we go through this process is the agonist and antagonist pattern of motion. And do we have pre-programmed motor patterns? So one of the ideas is this time required for the onset of the agonist and opposite of the antagonist muscles are one that show us a level of skill and also a level of the ability for our system to respond rapidly to what's happening. What this graph is here from the Wadman paper is the idea of you have a normal and a blocked. This is the agonist tricep and the antagonist bicep. So because it's an antagonist and it's a bicep, you know that this is we're trying to extend the elbow, right? Because the tricep is the agonist muscle, meaning the goal of this task is elbow extension. And what you can see here is the timing of when things happened. In the blocked is simply, it's moving a bar into this process, and in the bar is either moving and it allows it to go through the full range of motion, or the bar is blocked and stopped from being able to move. And you can see generally they follow the same pattern of motion, right? But the one that is blocked has a phase shift here in this peak activation. Also has a little increased activation in EMG over the peak of the normal. And so you see a little difference in patterns, but generally, even though the pattern, the bar is blocked, you still have this general idea of the agonist and antagonist muscles working together. So that this idea leads to the idea that we have, according to the task, we have a pre-programmed motor pattern that has been utilized and been triggered to create the task. And sometimes it takes a lot for us to stop that pre-programmed motor pattern, especially with the agonist-antagonist motion, to generate something different. And so this idea is the idea of pre-programming our motor pattern prior to the completion. And even though it becomes blocked, it is hard for us to deter and change from that motor pattern. This brings on this concept of the Rob Gray paper, and I'm going to post this paper, and I want you guys to spend some time with it because there will be some questions on it in the future. But it's the idea of checking a baseball swing, right? And so we have this pre-programmed swing, and the idea is it's a very fast action. If you look through here from windup to swing through, on average, they have it 5.5 seconds. And so it is very fast, and I think that is actually in milliseconds. No, it is in seconds. So it's 0.5, so it's 50 milliseconds. And that's how quickly this baseball swing is. And what I want you to do is read this paper, and you'll learn what all the launch angle, out of range inhibition, early trajectory, what all this relies. But essentially it is this. There are going to be individual stop signals that are seen throughout the swing phase that if you read the paper, you'll figure out that depending on when the stop signal is achieved is a very strong predictor of the ability for the swing to stop and to check the follow. Now this is for something that is when they're trying to check a swing, right? So if I'm checking a swing and it's called a strike, it's because the baseball bat went beyond the home plate. If during my swing I had one of these stop signals and I didn't fully swing, then again I was successful in checking my swing, and my swing was inhibited, or I had a partial response, or there was an interrupted response going through the process. So I will also produce a discussion on this paper, so we can all look at it. But here are some of the results from the study, and you can see that the mean proportion of successful swings. So if they had a full swing, the ball was within the range, and below range. And so this process here is the launch angle and what they were looking at and how successful they were within each one. So it inhibited below and above range. But this graph here is really where I want you to spend a lot of time focusing, and that's the bat distance from the front of the plate, and these are the individual responses that were given. And so I want you to be able to talk about that graph going forward, and I'm going to do a whole separate presentation on this PowerPoint so we can get that going straight for you. But as we look at the type of motor program and what happens with the error, there's a program selection. The outcomes are a result of intentional decisions. There's an inappropriate decision and a required selection of a new program. And then the program execution is sometimes there's an unexpected event occurs, and this is going to alter the outcome of that appropriate selection. And then it's an estimation of the mass and friction are often incorrect. And so these are situations when we have an incorrect or an error in the type of motor program selected. And sometimes it's in the selection process, and sometimes it's in the execution process. And oftentimes it's because these are feed-forward systems, right? And so it's an open, and we're not adjusting. It's just I do the task. Sometimes we either choose a wrong selection for the task, and I just started thinking about parkour, right? And sometimes we forget how far to jump, or we misjudge how much force we need to apply on the ground to make the jump, or whatever that task is. And then sometimes it's in the execution of it. Sometimes we put our hand in the wrong placement or our foot in the wrong placement. Sometimes we misjudge that friction on the ground and our foot slips. I just thought about this a lot when I played defensive back, and sometimes as I put my foot down, I put it in the wrong position when I'm trying to break forward out of my back pedal, and my back foot would slip. And so because it wasn't placed in the right position, and the force that I put on the ground, it slipped underneath me because that frictional component was not enough to outweigh or outdo the amount of force in that direction that was applied. So this is just a nice table I just want you to go and spend some time looking at, right? And so this is characteristics of corrections for the errors in selection and execution. And this is interesting because I just want you to know that I'm not the only one that makes edit errors in this graph, right? So if the characteristics, selection, execution, the latency of correctness, these are all the different processes it goes through. Just to add a little extra information. Hicks law applies, remember Hicks law. New program selected, if the selection process, characteristic corrections you can, but execution no. And that's because of the goals that are spatial, temporal, and the components. But really remember that there are two kind of components that come into the types of motor program and error, and that can be either in the selection or the execution. And so there's many ways that we can have these errors.